The coffee is already on. You can smell it before anything else, that particular darkness cutting through the cool morning air of a house still asleep. A kitchen in 1943. The window above the sink faces east, and there is just enough light coming in now to tell the world from the sky. Barely. The kind of light that exists just before light really begins. She is already here. Moving from counter to stove to icebox with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this so many times the body knows the sequence without the mind needing to manage it. A cast iron skillet. A wooden spoon set across the rim of a pot. The low tick and click of a gas range igniting, and then the blue ring of flame steadying itself, becoming reliable, becoming the center of the room. The radio is not on yet. That comes later. Right now it is just her, and the coffee, and the morning. And she has so much work to do. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. I want to take you inside the house first. Not the war. Not the ration book. Not the victory garden or the scrap drive or any of the 100 things we will come to in time. Just the house. The specific geography of a 1940s American home, the way it smelled, the way it was organized, the way its rooms arranged themselves around the life lived inside them. Because to understand what these women did, you have to first understand the physical world they did it in. A typical American family home in the early 1940s was, by the standards of what came after, modest. This is not a description of poverty. This is simply how houses were proportioned then, sized for a life that had not yet been inflated by post-war prosperity and the great suburban expansion that would follow it. The average new home built in 1940 was somewhere around 1,100 square feet. That is smaller than many studio apartments today in certain American cities. But inside those 1,100 square feet, a great deal of living happened, and the way those square feet were arranged tells you something important about what that life valued. The kitchen was the largest room. Not the living room. Not the bedroom. The kitchen. And this was not an accident of architecture. It was a statement of priorities. In a 1940s American house, the kitchen was sized to do real work, to hold a woman moving through a full day of physical labor, to accommodate the pressure canner and the stockpot and the bread bowl all at once, to have counter space for rolling dough and a table large enough for the family to pull their chairs up to for 3 meals a day. The kitchen was built to be used, hard, for long hours, by someone who knew what she was doing. The center of the kitchen was the range. By 1940, most urban and suburban American homes had made the transition from wood or coal stoves to gas ranges, and that transition had changed the rhythm of domestic life in ways that are difficult to fully convey to someone who has never had to manage a wood fire. A gas range gave you something that no previous generation of American women had ever had: heat that appeared immediately, at your command, at a precise level, and that disappeared the moment you turned a knob. No banking the coals the night before. No coaxing a fire from damp wood on a cold morning. No waiting for the oven to come up to temperature while the family stood around hungry. The gas range was, in the vocabulary of domestic life, a form of power. And the women who cooked on those ranges understood it as such. They learned their stoves the way a craftsman learns a tool, its particular quirks, the burner that ran a little hot, the oven that baked more evenly on one side, the way the pressure changed in winter and what that meant for the flame. A woman who had cooked on the same range for 5 years knew that appliance the way a pianist knows an instrument. Not abstractly. In her hands. Beside the range was usually a small counter space, enough for a mixing bowl, a cutting board, the essential tools. Above it, a cabinet. Below it, a drawer. Everything in a 1940s kitchen was within reach of a woman standing at her work, which sounds obvious until you compare it to the sprawling, aesthetically designed kitchens that came later, with their distance and their surfaces and their look-at-me design that sometimes seemed to have been built for photography rather than cooking. The icebox, or by the early 1940s, for families who could afford it, the refrigerator, stood against one wall. In 1940, only about 44% of American homes had a mechanical refrigerator. The rest still used the traditional icebox, a well-insulated cabinet that required regular deliveries of ice from the iceman to keep its interior cool. By 1944, wartime production priorities had slowed the manufacture of new refrigerators to a trickle, and the refrigerator you had when the war began was very likely the one you would have when it ended. You took care of it accordingly. The pantry was its own room in many homes, a small, cool, dim space off the kitchen where dry goods were stored, where the canning jars stood in their rows, where the flour bin and the sugar canister and the salt box lived. In a 1940s kitchen, the pantry was not decorative. It was strategic. What was in the pantry on any given week was the information a woman carried in her head, because the pantry told you what dinner was possible, what dinners were probable, and what you would need to acquire before the end of the week. I want to pause here and describe the smell of that pantry. It is a particular smell, dry and slightly sweet, a layering of flour and vanilla extract and the faint wooden scent of the shells themselves, and underneath those, the faint mineral smell of canning jars, and deeper still, something you can't quite name, which is probably the smell of order. The smell of a space where things are in their places and accounted for. If you have ever stood in an old farmhouse pantry, or in the back room of a certain kind of old grocery store, you know this smell. It is not glamorous. It is better than glamorous. It is the smell of sufficiency. The smell of enough, carefully managed. Beyond the kitchen, the rest of the house arranged itself simply. A living room, or in working-class homes, what was often called the front room, with its sofa and its chairs and, most importantly for the 1940s, its console radio. The radio was not a piece of background technology in 1940s America. It was the center of the living room in a way that television would become later, and that smartphones occupy now. But unlike those later technologies, the radio was communal. You gathered around it. You sat close enough to hear it clearly, and the family arranged itself in the room around the set. The radio was where you learned about the war. It was where you listened to Jack Benny on Sunday evenings, where Glenn Miller played, where the Andrews sisters sang, where Edward R. Murrow's voice came in from London on nights when London was burning. The radio was the world coming into the house, and in wartime, the world came in with an urgency that made it impossible to turn away. The bedrooms were small and purposeful. A double bed, a chest of drawers, a closet if you were fortunate, a rag rug on a hardwood floor. Children often shared rooms as a matter of course, and not just in poorer families. The idea that each child required their own private bedroom was a later development, a post-war prosperity assumption that 1940s families would have found slightly extravagant. Space was for living in, not for spreading out into. The bathroom was functional. One bathroom per family was standard, regardless of how many people were in the family. Hot water was, for most families, available but not assumed, meaning that you thought about your use of it, that you did not run the water indefinitely while it heated, that you filled the bathtub to a considered depth rather than simply stepping into a shower and forgetting about it. And the basement. In the 1940s American home, the basement was not wasted space. It was a workshop, a storage room, a second pantry for canned goods, and in many homes, the site of a furnace that needed tending and a boiler that required attention and a coal bin that had to be managed. Some basements had workbenches where the husband made repairs, where the tools were kept, where the rubber tires and the scrap metal collected during the drives were stored until the collection truck came. And in some basements, in the back behind the furnace or along the far wall, there was a second cache of canning jars, the overflow from the pantry upstairs, the full quarts of green beans and tomatoes and peaches put up in August that would be eaten in January and February when the garden was bare and the budget was tight. Now I want to ask you something. When was the last time you thought about the physical space where you live as a site of production? Not consumption, production. Most of us in the modern era live in spaces that are oriented toward consuming things, buying food, ordering delivery, streaming content, storing purchased goods. The house is a container for acquired things. The 1940s American home was different in its orientation. It was a site of production. Food was grown in the backyard and put up in the basement. Clothes were mended, turned, and resized in the living room. Bread was baked from scratch in the kitchen. Repairs were made in the basement. The home produced as well as consumed, and the woman who ran it was, in the most literal sense of the phrase, a household manager, someone running an operation with inputs and outputs and inventory and labor and a product that emerged every single day, a family, fed and clothed and held together. This is not nostalgia. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to slide into a romanticization of the 1940s domestic world that the actual women who lived it would find baffling and somewhat insulting. The physical labor was exhausting. The constraints were real. The isolation could be profound. There was nothing charming about a Monday morning in February in a house without central heat, with 3 children to get ready for school and a week's worth of laundry to do by hand. But understanding the house as a production system, rather than simply a living space, is essential to understanding what these women actually did during the war years. Because when the war came, and the resources contracted, and the ration books arrived, and the men left, what happened was not that these women were suddenly tasked with managing a new and unfamiliar operation. They were tasked with managing the same operation they had always managed, with fewer inputs. And that, it turns out, is a very different kind of problem than starting from scratch. There is something specific I want you to understand about the kitchen as the center of wartime domestic life, and it requires a small detour into what the gas range actually replaced. Before the gas range, Before the coal range and the wood cook stove and the various transitions that preceded it, the hearth had been the center of every home. Not the fireplace in the living room. The fire in the kitchen. The fire that had to be maintained at all times, that had to be fed and read and managed the way you manage a living thing, because it was a living thing. The fire was warmth and light and food and the chemical heart of the household, and the woman who tended it was doing something that went beyond cooking. She was keeping the center alive. The gas range replaced the fire with something more controllable, more predictable, more efficient. But it retained the fire's symbolic position. The kitchen was still where you went when you were cold. It was still where you went when you were frightened or uncertain. It was still the room that smelled like food and safety and the particular warmth of something simmering on a surface that was slightly too hot to touch. In a 1943 kitchen, the gas range was the hearth. And the woman who stood in front of it at 6 in the morning, before anyone else was awake, already thinking about what the family would eat for the next 3 days, she was not simply a cook. She was, in the oldest and deepest sense of that word, keeping the home. The physical geography of the 1940s house extended beyond its walls. Out the back door was the yard, and in a wartime America, the yard was increasingly a functional space rather than an ornamental one. The Victory Garden movement transformed millions of suburban backyards from lawns to growing plots between 1942 and 1945. We will spend a great deal of time in those gardens later. But even before the war, the American domestic yard had a working character that is easy to forget now. A clothesline. A small shed for tools. In many neighborhoods, a chicken or two. In others, a rabbit hutch. These were not hobby items. They were resources. And then the street itself. The neighborhood. In 1943, the American neighborhood functioned as a support structure in a way that is genuinely difficult to replicate from a vantage point 80 years later, in an era of individual car ownership and private yards and the general collapse of the neighborhood as a unit of mutual aid. Women knew their neighbors. Not acquaintance level knew. Genuinely knew. They knew which woman had a pressure canner and would lend it. They knew which family had a larger garden and might have extra tomatoes come August. They knew who was struggling with a sick child and might need a meal brought over, and they knew that next week, when their own turn came, the same would be returned to them. The neighborhood was not a place where people lived next to each other. It was a place where people managed together. The block warden, a civilian volunteer appointed in most American urban neighborhoods to organize civil defense, maintain blackout compliance, manage scrap drives, and serve as a point of contact between the neighborhood and the larger war effort, was almost always a woman in the years when the men were away. She knew where every family's vulnerabilities were. She knew which households were without their men, which had children too young for school, which were managing on the thinnest margins. She was the institution of the neighborhood, human scale. I keep returning to a simple image when I think about the 1940s American house. It is not a dramatic image. There is no crisis in it, no heroism, no moment of great sacrifice. It is just a woman standing at her kitchen sink at the end of a long day, looking out the window at the darkening yard, washing a pot that will be used again tomorrow morning. The radio is on in the other room, Jack Benny, maybe, or the Andrews Sisters, and she can hear it but is not quite listening to it. She is thinking about the menu for tomorrow. She is calculating whether the red stamps will stretch through Friday. She is noting that the butter is running low and the next delivery of her point allocation at the grocery is Thursday. She is holding the entire logistics of the household in her head, simultaneously, without writing it down, without anyone asking her to account for it. It is not a glamorous image. But it is, I think, one of the most accurate images of what it actually looked like to run a wartime American household. Not the poster version, the bright-faced woman with the kerchief and the determined smile. Just a woman at a window, thinking, the day's work behind her and tomorrow's already beginning. The house she lived in was her domain, her responsibility, and in the years of the war, increasingly her weapon. Not in the dramatic sense. In the quiet sense. In the sense that every pot of soup that stretched the meat ration a little further was a small act of strategic competence. In the sense that every jar put up in August was a hedge against the winter. In the sense that keeping this particular 1,100 square feet of American life running, fed, and functional, while a war happened across both oceans, required more skill and more endurance than most of the people who benefited from it ever fully understood. But she knew. And that knowledge, carried in her hands in her kitchen and her careful management of the pantry that smelled of flour and order, is what we are here to honor. Let me try to give you the morning. Not the idea of the morning. The actual morning. The specific quality of it, the texture of those first 30 minutes before the household came alive, because it is in those minutes that you can best see who she actually was, Not the woman in the role, the person inside it. The alarm clock was a wind-up. You could hear it ticking from the bed. She was awake before it went off, in all likelihood. That is a small but telling detail. Women who managed large households in the 1940s often developed the habit of waking slightly before the alarm, because the body, trained by years of early rising, calibrated itself to the schedule. The alarm was a backup. The body was the primary system. 5:30. 5:45. Somewhere in that range, depending on what the day required. She rose without turning on the overhead light. The bedroom was dark and her husband was still sleeping, if her husband was home, which in the middle years of the war, 1943 and 1944, was not always the case. She dressed in the dark from habit and practicality, and she moved through the hall to the kitchen on quiet feet, not from any romantic notion of her own privacy, but simply because there was no reason to wake anyone before it was necessary. The kitchen in those first minutes. She lit the burner under the percolator. The coffee in a 1940s kitchen was real coffee, percolated, not drip, not instant, though by 1942, coffee had been added to the ration list, allocated at £1 per adult per week, which sounds generous until you consider how long a pound of coffee actually lasted for a family that relied on it. The percolator was set on the back burner and the coffee was counted. 2 scoops. Maybe 2.5 if it was a particularly hard week. Not more. Not in wartime. While the coffee came up, she began the first calculations of the day. Not on paper. In her head, with the practiced fluency of someone who has been running the same set of numbers for years. She knew what was in the pantry without looking. She knew what was in the icebox without opening it. She knew what the family would need for breakfast, what was possible for lunch, what she was building toward for dinner. She knew what day it was in the ration cycle, how many red stamps remained for meat and dairy, how many blue stamps for canned and processed goods, and she was calculating forward, the way a chess player calculates moves, thinking not just about today but about what today's choices would leave available for tomorrow and the day after. This is not an exaggeration. A 1943 housewife managing a family of 4 on the standard OPA ration allocation had approximately 64 red points per person per month for meats, fats, fish, and dairy, 256 red points for the family, and 48 blue points per person for canned and processed goods, 192 blue points for the family. These points had to be allocated across an entire month of meals, across the fluctuating point values of individual products, point costs that the Office of Price Administration adjusted based on supply and could change week to week, and across the unpredictable availability of the stores themselves. It was a management problem. And she solved it, every day, before the coffee was done percolating, while standing at the kitchen counter in a dress she had sewn herself. The breakfast itself was simple by necessity and design. Oatmeal was a wartime staple, inexpensive, filling, not rationed, and easy to make in quantity. A pot of oatmeal could feed a family of 4 for 12 cents and required nothing more complex than boiling water and stirring. The children did not love it, as a rule. Children rarely love oatmeal in the abstract. But they ate it, and they were full, and that was what mattered. Some mornings there was an egg, fried or scrambled, allocated with the same care as everything else. Eggs in 1943 were rationed at 1 per adult per week, though families with children might have slightly more access through the priority allocations for children's nutrition. Bread was homemade in most 1940s households. This is a fact that tends to stop modern readers for a moment, so let me sit with it. In the early 1940s, before the large-scale commercial bread industry had fully established itself as the default, most American women baked their own bread. Not occasionally, as a hobby. Routinely, as part of the weekly rhythm of the household. Bread baked on Tuesday meant sandwiches for the rest of the week. Stale bread from the end of the week became croutons, bread pudding, breading for the next week's meat. Nothing was wasted. The bread she baked in the morning might be white, though by 1943, flour itself had been reformulated into a whiter-milled but nutrient-supplemented version that the government promoted, or it might be cornbread, which required less wheat flour and could be made with cornmeal that was both inexpensive and easily available. Cornbread in a cast-iron skillet was one of the wartime kitchen's staple achievements. It came out golden and hot and smelling of something so good that even the most careful rationing calculation allowed for the children to have an extra slice. But before the bread was baked and before the oatmeal was ready and before anyone else had come to the kitchen, there were the morning tasks that happened before anything was cooked at all. She checked the coal or the fuel supply. In gas-range homes, she was checking the availability of gas for the day's cooking, though in most municipal systems this was not a variable. She checked the icebox temperature. She assessed the state of the coffee. She noted what had been used from the previous night and what remained. She looked at the garden through the kitchen window. There was almost always a garden by 1943, because the Victory Garden campaign had made its way into nearly every American backyard, and she registered what might be ready to pick and what needed attention. All of this happened in the first quiet minutes of the day. Before breakfast. Before the children. Before the husband if he was home. It was, I think, the only genuinely private time she had. I want to pause here and offer you an observation about that privacy. In the accounts that survive from the wartime years, the letters, the diaries, the oral histories gathered in the decades afterward, women who were asked about those early morning hours often described them with a quality of feeling that is different from the rest of their daily account. Warm is the word that comes to mind, though that is not quite precise. More accurately, grounded. That first hour in the kitchen, before anyone else required anything of her, was the hour when she knew who she was outside of what she owed to others. She was not a wife. Not yet. Not a mother. Not yet. She was a woman in a kitchen, with her coffee, thinking. Mrs. Walter Davis of Columbus, Ohio, whose letters to her husband in the Pacific were preserved and later donated to the Ohio History Connection, described her morning routine in a letter dated February 1944 with a particularity of detail that suggests these mornings mattered to her as a category of their own. She wrote that she liked the hour before the children woke because it was hers, and she could think about Walter without worrying about her face while she did it. That last phrase, without worrying about her face, is one of the most revealing things I have read from any wartime domestic account. She was not performing for anyone in those morning minutes. The composure she maintained all day, for the children, for the neighbors, for the whole forward-facing project of keeping the household running as though everything were manageable, could be set down briefly in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning while the coffee percolated. She could miss him without having to look fine while she did it. That small private grief, held inside the morning hour and then folded away before the children came down, is something that the history books rarely discuss. The emotional management required of wartime housewives was as demanding as the logistical management, perhaps more so, because it left fewer external traces. You could measure how much butter was left in the ration allocation. You could not measure the weight of a woman eating breakfast alone at a kitchen table where a chair was empty. Now let me give you the rest of the morning. The children came down between 7 and 7:30, in that slightly chaotic rush of small people who have been asleep and are now suddenly not asleep and require things. Shoes. Breakfast. Explanations of where things are. The particular quality of morning noise generated by children preparing for school is something that has not changed across the decades. The same sounds, the same friction, the same small negotiations over who gets the bathroom first and whether oatmeal is acceptable when there is no alternative. She managed this with what I can only describe as professional competence. That word, professional, is one that was rarely applied to housewives in the 1940s, either by the women themselves or by the culture around them. The domestic work of the era was overwhelmingly described in the language of love and duty rather than skill and expertise. Magazines used the language of devotion. Government pamphlets used the language of patriotism. Nobody used the language of professional competence, because that language was reserved for work that happened in offices and factories and fields. But professional competence is exactly what it was. The woman who moved her family from asleep to fed to dressed to out the door in 90 minutes while managing the kitchen, monitoring the schedules, mediating the small disputes, packing the lunches from a ration allocation that left her with approximately 2 tablespoons of butter to stretch across 4 sandwiches, that woman was executing a complex logistical operation. The fact that she was doing it in a kitchen rather than a boardroom did not make it less complex. It made it more so, because unlike the boardroom, there was no support staff, no backup, no one to hand the problem to when it exceeded her bandwidth. She was the entire department. The lunches. This is where I want to slow down, because the school lunch of the 1940s is a window into the kind of daily creativity the era required. A school lunch in 1943 had to be nutritious, portable, and made almost entirely from whatever was available within the constraints of the week's ration allocation. The sandwich was the default format, and the filling of that sandwich was the daily negotiation. Peanut butter was unrationed and filling and nutritious, which is why 1940s children ate approximately 10,000 peanut butter sandwiches. Peanut butter and honey when the honey lasted. Peanut butter and jam from the summer's canning. Peanut butter plain, on bread that might or might not have a smear of margarine, butter being too precious to spread on a sandwich that was going to be eaten out of a paper bag. When peanut butter was supplemented with something more substantial, a piece of cheese, a slice of meat from the Sunday roast, it was because she had planned for it, had saved the appropriate stamps, had bought the right cut at the right point value. The child who came home on Friday and found a sandwich with a real slice of ham had a mother who had been thinking about that sandwich since Monday. The apple was not always available. The orange was rarely available. What went into the lunch bag was a function of what was in the garden, what was in the canning jars, and what the stamp allocation permitted. A hard-boiled egg, saved from the week's allocation. A carrot from the Victory garden, peeled and wrapped in wax paper. A cookie if she had managed to bake them, made with the weekly sugar ration that for a family of 4 totaled about 2 pounds, which sounds like a lot until you start dividing it across every cooking and baking need of a whole week. When the children were out the door, the quiet came back. And she turned to the rest of the day. The rest of the day was enormous. The laundry alone, and we will come back to laundry in a later act, because it deserves its own attention, could consume half of a Monday. The cleaning. The mending, because fabric was rationed and clothes were repaired rather than replaced. The garden. The cooking of the main meal, which in the 1940s was almost always eaten at midday if the family was at home, or if not, assembled in the evening from whatever she had prepared. The shopping, which was not a single trip to a single store but a managed circuit of multiple merchants, each of whom carried different things and might or might not have what she needed. The shopping deserves particular attention. A 1940s housewife shopping under wartime rationing was not shopping in the modern sense of the word. She was not browsing. She was not selecting among options. She was on a procurement mission, and the logistics of that mission were considerable. She had to know, before she left the house, which store she was going to and why. Her butcher, where her family was registered and whose allocation she managed. The grocer, for the canned goods that required blue stamps. The dairy, if her neighborhood still had a separate dairy delivery. The farm stand or vegetable market where unrationed fresh produce could be found, though by the middle of the war, unrationed produce was increasingly also in short supply, not because of the rationing system but simply because of the larger disruptions to supply chains that the war created. She also had to manage the stamps. The OPA ration books were not simple. Each family member had their own book, and the books had to be coordinated. She carried them all when she shopped, her own and the children's, and the husband's if he was away and had left them behind, which many servicemen did so their families could use the full allocation. She sorted the stamps by type, by point value, and by expiration date, because stamps expired at the end of their valid period and unspent points did not roll over. She was managing a currency that degraded in value over time, and every week's planning included an assessment of which stamps were closest to expiring and needed to be prioritized. This is the part of the wartime domestic story that I find most consistently underappreciated, even in the historical accounts that attempt to be comprehensive about it. The cognitive load. The sheer amount of information that had to be held in active management, the inventory, the point values, the expiration dates, the family's preferences and nutritional needs, the state of the garden, the menu plan, the shopping circuit, was enormous. And it was held not in a spreadsheet or an app but in a woman's head, maintained continuously, across every other demand of a busy day, without any recognition that this was a form of mental labor that deserved acknowledgement. Her neighbor Edna, who she would see on the way to the butcher, was carrying the same load. They would compare notes on the sidewalk, what was available where, what the point costs were running this week, whether anyone had managed to find canned salmon, and move on, 2 women in coats and sensible shoes, holding the logistics of the war in their heads. That sidewalk conversation was, in its modest way, a form of supply chain intelligence. They knew things the government's own analysts sometimes didn't, what was actually available on the ground, what the real shortages were versus the official allocations, where substitutions were working and where they were failing. The collective knowledge of the neighborhood was a genuine intelligence network, informal and unacknowledged, but real and effective. I want to return to the kitchen in the late morning, after the shopping, when she has come home and the bags are on the counter and the morning is quiet and there is a cup of reheated coffee going cold next to the sink. She is not resting. She is planning. She is looking at what she has and building toward dinner, and dinner is not the only thing she is building. She is thinking about the week, the same way a general thinks about a campaign, knowing that a choice made today closes off certain options tomorrow, that the meat she uses tonight determines what she can offer on Thursday, that the canning jar she opens this week is a jar she cannot open in February. The women who managed this successfully, and most of them did manage it, because the alternative was a family that did not eat, had developed, through necessity, a form of strategic thinking that was entirely practical, entirely grounded, and entirely invisible to the people it served. The children ate. The family was fed. Dinner appeared on the table every night. And the planning that made it happen was so embedded in the fabric of the morning that it seemed, from the outside, like no planning at all. Just a woman in a kitchen. As though it were simple. There is a moment I want to walk you through. It is an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the winter of 1943. The kitchen is warm. The radio is on low in the other room, a soap opera, perhaps, or the news at 2:30, or just the hiss of an empty frequency between programs. She is standing at the kitchen counter with her ration book open to the meat and dairy pages and a small pencil in her hand. The week's red stamp allocation for her family of 4 is 256 points. On the counter beside the ration book is a folded sheet of newsprint from the local paper, a table of current OPA point values for ration goods that the paper runs every Monday because the point costs change week to week and you cannot plan without the current numbers. She is moving her finger down the table. A pound of chuck roast, 12 points. A pound of pork shoulder, 14. A can of Spam, 7. A pound of cheddar, 8. A pint of sour cream, 4. A dozen eggs. The eggs come from the dairy allocation, not the meat stamps, and require the green book for the children's allocation if you want to count the full family's entitlement. She is doing the arithmetic. This is not a dramatic scene. There is nothing in it that would make a movie. But I want you to understand that this scene, a woman at a kitchen counter with a pencil and a list and a set of numbers she is working through, was repeated in some form in virtually every American household every single week of the war years. And the skill with which a woman navigated those numbers determined, in a very direct way, what her family ate. The Office of Price Administration was established in April of 1941, initially to control prices as the military buildup began creating inflationary pressure. By early 1942, with the United States fully at war following Pearl Harbor, the OPA had taken on its most significant function, administering a national food rationing program designed to ensure equitable distribution of foods needed for the war effort. The OPA ration book for processed and canned goods, the Blue Book, had 48 points per person per month. The Red Book, for meats, fats, fish, and dairy, had 64 points per person per month. Point values were not fixed. They were adjusted by the OPA's economists based on supply and demand, updated weekly, and published in every newspaper in the country. The system was designed to be flexible. If too much beef was being consumed relative to pork, the OPA would raise the point cost of beef and lower pork, and purchasing behavior would shift accordingly. In theory, the invisible hand of the market and the visible hand of the government working in concert to distribute food equitably across 250 million people. In practice, it was a woman with a pencil at a kitchen counter. The rationing system in America was structured differently from the British system, and the differences are instructive. Britain rationed by weight. You received a specific number of ounces of bacon, butter, or sugar per week, and that was that. The quantities were fixed and the items were fixed. What you got on Monday you had until the following Monday, and if you used it all on Tuesday, you waited. The American system used points rather than weights, and it gave consumers some degree of choice within the points. You could spend your 64 red points on one expensive item or on several cheaper ones. You could make a strategic decision about which cut of meat gave you the most nutrition for the fewest points, which canned goods were undervalued relative to their nutritional content, where the gaps in the system were and how to exploit them legally and intelligently. It rewarded, in other words, a certain kind of intelligence. The American housewife who was good at the rationing game, and there were women who genuinely excelled at it, who followed the OPA point changes the way investors follow stock prices, who understood the system well enough to find consistent advantages within it, fed her family demonstrably better than the woman who could not or did not engage with the system at that level. Let me give you some of the specific strategies that the women who were most skilled at wartime cooking developed, because they are worth understanding not as historical curiosities but as practical expressions of a genuine intelligence operating under constraint. The first strategy was organ meats. Liver, heart, kidneys, tongue, tripe, the internal organs of beef and pork were among the least popular cuts in pre-war American cooking. They were associated with poverty, with old country cooking, with the habits of people who could not afford the prime cuts. Middle-class American housewives before the war largely avoided them. Under rationing, organ meats became valuable. This was because of a structural quirk in the OPA rationing system. Organ meats were initially unrationed or carried very low point values, because demand for them was low enough that supply was not a problem. A pound of beef liver might cost you 4 points when a pound of chuck roast cost 12. For a housewife working with 256 monthly points, the math was immediate and obvious. 3 pounds of liver gave you more servings than 1 pound of chuck, for the same or fewer points, and the nutritional content of liver, which is, as it happens, extremely high in iron, vitamin A, and B vitamins, was better than the more desirable cuts. The wartime cookbooks and the OPA's own recipe leaflets pushed organ meats relentlessly. They dressed them up. they gave them new names. They embedded them in casseroles and stews and dishes that obscured their identity until the family had already committed to eating them. A liver and onion casserole was still liver, but with enough onions and enough broth and enough time in the oven, it was tolerable. And it fed 4 people for 9 red points. The second strategy was stretching. Stretching a meat ration was a skill that 1940s housewives developed to a high art, and the techniques they used are still, in certain food cultures, recognizable today. A single pound of ground beef, handled correctly, could feed a family of 4. You began by making a meatloaf rather than patties or a sort. The loaf format allowed you to incorporate filler ingredients that extended the volume and the nutritional profile of the dish without reducing its essential character as a meat dish. Into that pound of ground beef went a cup of oatmeal or breadcrumbs, soft breadcrumbs made from the stale bread end of the week's baking, soaked in a little milk, mixed into the meat to extend it. Chopped onion, salt, pepper, a beaten egg if one was available. Packed into the loaf pan, topped with whatever thin sauce could be made from the week's tomato ration, baked for an hour. What came out of the oven was a dense, filling, nutritionally complete main dish that served 4 adults generously. And the next day, the leftover slices went into sandwiches. And the day after that, whatever remained was crumbled into a hash with potatoes, fried until crisp, and served for breakfast or a light dinner. A pound of ground beef, in competent hands, could easily produce 3 meals. This is not magic. It is craft. The third strategy was substitution. The wartime kitchen ran on substitutions. The principle was always the same: identify the function a rationed ingredient served in a dish, and find something that performed the same function from an unrationed or lower point source. Butter was the most consistently substituted ingredient in the wartime kitchen. The function of butter in cooking is to add fat, richness, and flavor. Margarine, which had been around since the 1870s but had always been associated with poverty and considered inferior, performed the fat and richness functions adequately, and the wartime fortification of margarine with vitamins A and D, mandated by the government, actually made it nutritionally comparable to butter in some respects. Flavor was harder to replicate, but when you had been cooking with margarine for 3 years, your palate adjusted, and dishes designed specifically for margarine rather than adapted from butter-based recipes often came out well. Oleo, as housewives called it, from the original name oleomargarine, was a wartime constant. You bought it in a white block with a capsule of yellow food coloring included, because federal regulations at the time prohibited the sale of margarine in the same yellow color as butter. The housewife's job was to knead the coloring capsule into the white block until the whole mass turned a convincing butter yellow. This was accomplished in a small plastic bag. The kneading took several minutes. Children were sometimes enlisted to help. It was, depending on your perspective, either a mild indignity or a small domestic ritual. For sugar, the primary substitute was saccharine, available without rationing as a pharmaceutical product and used in cooking and baking when the sugar ration ran low. Saccharine was not perfect. It had a slightly metallic aftertaste that a practiced cook could sometimes mask with vanilla and warm spices, but not always. The cakes made with saccharine were not the same as the cakes made with real sugar, and everyone at the table knew it, and no one said so, because what was the point of saying so? Molasses, corn syrup, and honey were also used as partial sugar substitutes in baking, with mixed results. Honey behaved differently from sugar in baked goods. It added moisture, browned faster, and had its own strong flavor, which meant that a honey-substituted cake was not simply a sugar cake with honey instead. It was a different cake, requiring its own adjustments, its own technique, its own understanding of how heat and moisture and leavening interacted under the new conditions. Learning to bake with honey instead of sugar was, in miniature, the entire project of the wartime kitchen. You did not simply swap one thing for another. You learned a new way. The fourth strategy, and this is the one I find most quietly impressive, was nutritional architecture. The best wartime cooks were not just stretching their budgets and their stamps. They were thinking about nutrition in a way that most American housewives had not previously had reason to think about it systematically. The OPA and the Department of Agriculture both put enormous effort into educating women about the nutritional content of foods, because they understood that a ration diet could still be a healthy diet if it was intelligently planned, and that an unplanned ration diet could become nutritionally inadequate in ways that would not be immediately obvious. The USDA's wartime nutrition posters featured the basic 7 food groups, a precursor to later food pyramid models, and the government distributed millions of copies to schools, grocery stores, and OPA rationing boards. Nutrition education was embedded in the rationing program because the program's architects understood that stretching the food supply and maintaining population health were not automatically compatible goals. Stretching the food supply without nutritional guidance could produce a population that was full but malnourished in specific ways. The women who internalized this guidance, and many did, because the OPA and the USDA were everywhere in the wartime domestic environment, their leaflets and posters and radio programs a constant presence, began planning their meals around nutritional coverage rather than simply around point costs. The question was not just, what can I make with what I have? It was, what does my family need, and how do I provide it with what I have? Green leafy vegetables for iron and vitamins. Whole grain for B vitamins. Dairy for calcium and fat-soluble vitamins. A protein source at the main meal. Fruit when available, canned or fresh, for vitamin C. This was not intuition. This was learned, applied knowledge, operating in a kitchen under pressure, producing dinner at 6 o'clock. Now let me give you a specific dinner. It is Thursday, late in the month, and the red stamps are getting thin. She has half a pound of ground beef remaining in her meat allocation for the week. She has a jar of her own canned tomatoes from August, put up when the garden came in and the tomatoes were so abundant she was bringing bushels of them in from the yard. She has potatoes, several pounds, stored in the cool of the basement, still firm. She has onions. She has dried beans that she bought in the first week of the month when her blue stamps were fresh, and she soaked them last night because she had the sense something like this week was coming. She is making a dish with no official name. She starts the beans simmering in plain water. She browns the half pound of ground beef, no oil, the fat from the meat is enough, until it is cooked through and fragrant, and then she lifts it out of the pan and adds the onion to the beef fat remaining in the skillet, and the onion goes soft and golden in that particular fat sizzle that smells like the beginning of something good. Then the tomatoes go in, with a little water to loosen them, and salt and pepper, and the beef goes back in, and it all simmers together for 20 minutes while she boils the potatoes separately. The beans come off the stove and she adds them to the beef and tomato mixture, and now the pot is full and the kitchen smells extraordinary, rich and savory and warm, the kind of smell that makes a kitchen feel like the center of everything again, which it is, and which she knows it is, even on a Thursday at the end of a thin month. She serves it over the boiled potatoes, mashed with a scrape of margarine and a splash of the milk she has saved. The family eats. There are no leftovers. The point cost of that meal was approximately 18 red points and 6 blue points for the canned tomatoes. The nutritional content included protein from both the beef and the beans, carbohydrate from the potatoes, lycopene from the tomatoes, and a reasonable coverage of the B vitamin and iron requirements for a family of 4. The cost in cash was perhaps 75 cents. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of meal that anyone would describe later with nostalgia and specific, loving detail. But it was real food, made from scratch, made with intelligence and care, from ingredients that were scarce and had to be managed carefully to produce it. This was Tuesday. This was Thursday. This was the whole war. There is a phrase I keep encountering in the diaries and letters of the wartime years, in different variations, from different women, and it stops me every time. I don't know how we did it. Said not with distress, usually. Said with a particular quality of retrospective wonder. Said by women looking back at the years of the ration book and the empty shelves and the thin weeks at the end of the month, and genuinely not quite being able to account for how the food had kept appearing on the table. I think the answer is that they knew more than they thought they knew. The intelligence they had acquired, about nutrition, about cost, about technique, about substitution, about planning, had become so embedded in the daily rhythm of the kitchen that it no longer felt like knowledge. It felt like just doing it. It felt like simply making dinner. But there was nothing simple about it. And the families who ate that dinner, who grew up eating those meals, the children who could not always name what was in the pot but who were never, in the vast majority of cases, actually hungry, those children were fed by something more than food. They were fed by their mother's intelligence, applied quietly and continuously, in a kitchen that smelled of tomatoes and browning onions, for the whole duration of the war. Begin with the soil. In March. Before anything is in the ground, before the last frost has fully passed, before the neighborhood has its gardens properly staked and planned. She is standing in the backyard in old clothes and rubber-soled shoes, and she has a spade in her hand. The yard in March, in most of the northern United States, is not a promising-looking thing. Brown. Wet. Still carrying the compressed weight of winter, which means the earth does not turn easily. It comes up in heavy clods that resist the spade and have to be broken with the flat of the blade and turned again. This is hard work. The kind of work that uses the muscles of the back and the shoulders, that leaves the hands blistered when you are not accustomed to it, that produces nothing visible by the end of the morning except a rectangle of turned earth that was previously a lawn. She worked it until the plot was ready. Or she planned and her husband worked it if he was home before leaving for the shipyard or the factory. Or she enlisted the children for the parts of the work a child could do, carrying away the sods, breaking up the larger clods with their feet, pulling the stones from the bed one by one and stacking them at the edge. The Victory Garden was often a family project in the physical sense, which was one of the things that the government's promotional campaigns had correctly understood and built their messaging around. It gave children a stake in the garden's outcome. When the tomatoes came in, the child who had pulled weeds from that row was invested in those tomatoes in a way that the child who had only eaten them never quite was. But the knowledge was hers. What to plant, when to plant it, how much space each crop required, which vegetables would do well in her particular soil in her particular yard, which would bolt in the heat of a July afternoon, which would need staking and which would sprawl. She had learned some of this from her own mother, or from a neighbor, or from the Extension Service literature that the USDA distributed aggressively during the war years, or from the radio garden programs that had proliferated after the Victory Garden campaign began in earnest in 1942. She had probably made mistakes in the first season. Most first-time gardeners did. The second season she made fewer. The third season she was competent. By 1944, the third growing season for most wartime gardeners, 20 million Victory Gardens were producing food in the United States. 20 million. In backyards and on rooftops and in schoolyards and in city parks and in the vacant lots of urban neighborhoods where women organized their block associations to pool their labor and their knowledge across a shared growing space. Approximately 40% of the fresh vegetables consumed by American civilians in 1943 came from these gardens. 2 in 5 vegetables on an American family's table in the middle years of the war had been grown by someone they knew, probably by themselves. This is a number that bears repeating because its scale is genuinely difficult to absorb from a 21st century vantage point. We live in an era in which the supply chain between a vegetable and your kitchen runs through industrial growing operations, mechanical harvesting, refrigerated distribution centers, and retail stores, and in which most people would not know how to grow a tomato from a seedling even if they had the space to do it. The transformation of 40% of the American civilian vegetable supply to home production in approximately 2 years is one of the most remarkable feats of voluntary domestic mobilization in the history of the modern world. And it happened largely through the labor of women. Now let me take you through the garden year, because it is not simply a matter of putting seeds in the ground and returning in August to pick them. March or April, depending on the climate, the ground is prepared. The bed is turned, the soil is amended. In a Victory Garden era, this meant mixing in whatever organic material was available, often compost from a backyard compost pile, kitchen scraps composted through the winter, and in many neighborhoods, the contributions of a nearby stable or farm if one existed. Soil preparation is the invisible work of a vegetable garden, the work that produces no visible results until months later when the plants begin fruiting, and a woman who did it carefully in March was investing in a harvest she would not see until July. April, the cold-tolerant crops go in first. Peas were the great early-season vegetable of the wartime garden. They went in as soon as the ground could be worked, they fixed nitrogen in the soil as they grew, they produced abundantly for a few weeks and then were done, and they could be eaten fresh or canned. Lettuce. Radishes, which matured in less than a month and gave the gardener her first harvest when everything else was still small. Spinach. Early onions. These cold-tolerant crops were the garden's first gift, proof, after the gray months of winter, that things still grew. May, the decision about tomatoes. The tomato was the center of the wartime Victory Garden, and for good reason. Tomatoes were useful in every form, fresh, stewed, canned, made into sauce, made into juice. They were highly productive in a relatively small space. They were not rationed and their canned version was expensive in blue stamps, which made growing your own a significant economic advantage. And tomatoes, perhaps more than any other vegetable, were what made the canning shelf possible. The seedlings were started indoors in March or purchased from the local nursery in late May. They went into the ground after the last frost date, a date that every experienced gardener in her neighborhood knew by rote, in the full sun, with a stake driven in beside each plant to support the weight of what was coming. She watered them carefully through the dry spells of early summer. She watched for the hornworm that could strip a plant to bare stems in a single night. She watched for blight. She watched for the white flies that clustered on the undersides of the leaves in hot weather. She watched over that garden the way you watch over something that matters. The rest of the summer, green beans, which could be put up in canning jars in enormous quantities and formed the backbone of many families' winter vegetable supply. Squash, which sprawled across more space than any first-time gardener anticipated but produced reliably and stored well. Cucumbers for pickling. Beets. Carrots. The corn that required more space than most urban gardens had, but that some women grew anyway in single rows along the fence line because the taste of fresh-picked sweet corn was something that even a war could not make you entirely stop wanting. And then August arrived. August in a wartime garden was not a relaxation. It was a crisis of abundance. Everything came in at once. The tomatoes turned from green to red faster than she could keep track of. The green beans were ready for picking every 3 or 4 days. Let them go longer and the pods toughened and the flavor declined. The cucumbers swelled overnight and the ones she missed turned yellow and bitter. The summer squash became winter squash if she looked away too long. The harvest had to be processed. That was the word, processed. Not eaten, though of course it was eaten, but processed in the particular wartime sense of the word. Preserved, put up, transformed from the perishable abundance of August into the stable food supply of December. This is where the pressure canner arrived. The pressure canner was not a glamorous appliance. It was a heavy, utilitarian piece of equipment, a large pot with a locking lid, a rubber gasket, a pressure gauge, and a weight or petcock for controlling the internal pressure. It sat on the back burner and it hissed. That hiss, a steady, rhythmic release of steam through the pressure release valve, was the soundtrack of August and September in every home where a woman was putting up food for the winter. And by 1943, that was almost every home. The process of home canning under the pressure method went like this. She washed the vegetables and prepared them, blanched, or just cleaned and trimmed, depending on the vegetable. She filled the sterilized quart jars to within an inch of the top. She wiped the jar rims with a clean cloth. She placed the lids, the flat lid and the screw band, the two-piece canning lid system that Ball and Kerr had standardized, and screwed them down finger-tight, not over-tight. She lowered the jars into the canner with a jar lifter, added 2 inches of water to the bottom, locked the lid, and brought the whole apparatus up to pressure. At 10 pounds of pressure, the standard for low-acid vegetables like beans and corn, she set the timer. 25 minutes for green beans. 90 minutes for corn. The times were not suggestions. They were food safety specifications. Under-processed canned vegetables were a botulism risk, and botulism is not a mild illness. Every experienced home canner in the 1940s knew this and took the processing time seriously. While the canner ran, she was not idle. She was preparing the next batch. Washing more jars. Blanching more beans. Managing the garden bounty that was accumulating on the counter, the kitchen table, the floor of the pantry, waiting its turn. A serious canning day in August lasted 12 hours. And at the end of it, when the canner had cooled and she could safely open the lid and lift out the jars with her padded hands, she lined them up on the counter and listened. The sound of a jar sealing is a small, flat, metallic click, the ping of the lid being drawn down by the vacuum that has formed as the contents cooled and contracted. Each ping was a small victory. A jar that pinged was a jar that was safely sealed, that would last through the winter without spoiling, that represented a piece of the August garden preserved against the coming months of scarcity. She lined them up on the counter and she counted them. And then she carried them downstairs and placed them on the shelf with the others, and she went back upstairs and did it again. The canning shelf. I want to try to convey what the canning shelf actually looked like, and what it meant, because it is one of the most characteristic and most beautiful material artifacts of the wartime domestic world. It was typically located in the basement, or in the coolest, darkest part of the pantry, on wooden shelves that her husband had built or that had been built by the previous occupant of the house. The shelves held the results of the growing season, the quarts and pints and half-pints arranged in rows, sorted by type and dated with a strip of masking tape or a grease pencil mark on the lid. Tomatoes in quart jars, deep red. Green beans, packed tight in their quarts, the pods still bright. Corn, creamed or whole kernel. Pickles of various kinds, bread and butter, dill, sweet. Jams and jellies, strawberry from June, raspberry from July, grape from the vine along the back fence in September. Applesauce, if there was a neighbor with an apple tree who was willing to share a bushel. Peaches in light syrup, if she had been able to find them at the farmer's market when they came in. In a good year, after a good season of work, that shelf might hold 100 quarts or more. 100 quarts of food that she had grown, harvested, cooked, and preserved with her own hands. Food that was outside the rationing system, unrationed, unstamped, belonging to no one but her family, available on any night in January when the stamps were thin and the stores were low. A hedge against the winter. A buffer against the worst weeks of the ration cycle. The canning shelf was a form of wealth. Not the kind of wealth that was measured in money or social position or any of the other currencies of the outside world. The kind of wealth that was measured in food on the table. The kind of wealth that you build slowly, with your hands, from the ground up, over a whole season of work. There is something I want to say about what it felt like to stand in front of that shelf in January. December and January are the months when the distance between summer and now feels longest, when the garden is buried under snow or frozen solid, when the fresh produce at the store is pale and expensive and shipped from somewhere far away. In a 1940s household managing a wartime diet, those months were the months when the canning shelf earned its place. She would come downstairs in the evening, or send one of the children, for a jar of tomatoes or a quart of green beans. She would hold the jar for a moment, and feel the coolness of it, and see through the glass the color of last summer still contained inside. And whatever she felt at that moment, satisfaction, relief, something harder to name, it was rooted in something entirely real. She had done this. This was hers. The woman next door knocked at the back door at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. This is how the neighborhood announced itself in the 1940s, at the back door, because the back door was the door for friends and neighbors, the door through which the daily life of the community circulated. The front door was for strangers. The back door was for everyone else. She came with an armful of late garden tomatoes, more than her family could use this week, and a question about canning times for low-acid vegetables, and the unspoken understanding that the exchange would happen in both directions, that there would be mornings when the armful was brought to her door instead. This was how the neighborhood worked. I want to spend this act talking about community in the 1940s American home front, because it is one of the aspects of the wartime domestic experience that has been most thoroughly lost to the subsequent decades. We talk about the rationing and the gardens and the sacrifices in roughly the right proportion to how much attention they received at the time. But we talk much less about the social infrastructure that made all of it possible, the dense, functional, mutually obligated web of neighborhood relationships that formed the actual operational support system for wartime domestic life. The neighborhood was not a pleasant bonus in the wartime American domestic world. It was a survival mechanism. Let me give you the dimensions of this. In 1943, the Office of Civil Defense, the federal agency responsible for coordinating civilian defense activities on the home front, estimated that approximately 11 million Americans were serving as block wardens, auxiliary firefighters, aircraft spotters, Red Cross volunteers, or in some other organized civilian defense capacity. That is roughly 8% of the entire American population in active organized civilian service. The block warden system was the operational unit of this infrastructure at the neighborhood level. Each block warden was responsible for a defined geographic area, typically one side of a city block, or 2 or 3 blocks in lower-density suburban areas, and their responsibilities included ensuring that blackout regulations were followed, that households with no functioning male adult were identified and supported, that information from the civil defense authorities was distributed to residents, and that the neighborhood functioned as a unit in any emergency. The block wardens were overwhelmingly women. Not because of any explicit policy. Because the men were elsewhere. And the women who took on this role, the women who became the institutional presence of the state at the most local, most intimate level of community life, discovered in the process something that they had not necessarily expected to find. Competence. Authority. A kind of public role that the pre-war domestic world had not offered them. The block warden who organized her neighbors for a scrap drive, who coordinated the care of a household whose husband had just been sent overseas, who managed the information flow between the civil defense authorities and the families on her street, that woman was doing something that required organizational skill, people management, logistical thinking, and a kind of calm under pressure that was not different in kind from what was happening in the offices and factories and military units of the wider war effort. She was managing people and resources toward a defined objective. And she was doing it without the title, the salary, or the recognition that would have attended the same work in any official capacity. The Red Cross was the second great community institution of the wartime neighborhood. The American Red Cross during the Second World War organized approximately 36 million volunteers, roughly 1 in every 4 Americans, in activities ranging from first aid training to blood drives to the production of surgical dressings and knitted clothing for servicemen. The knitting circles that became ubiquitous in the 1940s, groups of women meeting in church halls and living rooms and school gymnasiums to produce the millions of wool garments that American servicemen required, were Red Cross operations. In 1943, the Red Cross reported that its volunteers had produced more than 41 million surgical dressings, nearly 18 million knitted articles, and processed more than 300,000 pints of whole blood for military medical use. 41 million surgical dressings. Each one of those dressings was made by a woman sitting in a Red Cross workroom or a church hall with a pair of scissors and a roll of gauze, working at a table with other women, talking quietly, learning the news of the neighborhood, sharing the weight of the waiting. Because that is what the community gatherings of the wartime neighborhood were, at their core. Not just production operations. Not just social occasions. They were places where women who were carrying the same load could set it down together for a few hours, in company, without having to pretend that the load was not heavy. The letter-writing circles. This is one of the things about 1940s community life that I find most moving and that has nearly no equivalent today. In many neighborhoods, women organized what amounted to collective letter-writing sessions, gatherings at someone's kitchen table or dining room table where several women would sit down together to write their letters to husbands and sons and brothers overseas. Not because they needed help writing, these were articulate, capable women, but because the act of writing those letters in company made it slightly more bearable. There was a mutual understanding in these circles that nobody articulated directly. Writing the letter is the thing that keeps you aware of the distance, and the distance is easier to acknowledge when you are not doing it alone. The letters themselves were a whole subject. V-mail, the photographic reduction process that allowed letters to be microfilmed and shipped to military post offices as film rolls before being printed and delivered on the other end, was introduced in 1942, and the small, thin V-mail letters became one of the characteristic artifacts of the wartime correspondence. The censorship was real. Soldiers' letters had passages blacked out by military censors, and the letters from home were also reviewed, though less systematically. The women who wrote those letters learned to write around the things they could not say, to convey meaning in the structure and tone of what they could say, to trust that the person who knew them would understand what the censored version contained. This was another form of intelligence. Linguistic intelligence. The intelligence of communicating fully in a constrained medium. The scrap drives. Every American neighborhood during the war years participated in the scrap drives, organized campaigns to collect metals, rubber, paper, fats, and other materials needed for war production. The drives were managed at the neighborhood level, announced through the civil defense structure, and coordinated through the block wardens and the women's organizations. Fat collection deserves special mention because it is the element of the wartime scrap drive that surprises modern people most reliably. Kitchen fat, the grease rendered from bacon, the drippings from roasted meat, the accumulated fat from all the cooking a household did, was collected, filtered, and turned in at collection points. This fat was used in the production of glycerin, which was an ingredient in explosives. Every pound of fat turned in by American housewives went into the glycerin supply for shells and bombs. The women of 1940s America were, without any special ceremony about it, contributing directly to the production of military ordnance from their kitchen drippings. They kept the fat in a coffee can next to the stove. It was simply part of how you cooked. You rendered, you saved, you turned in. You did not think about where it went, or if you thought about it, you thought about it with the same pragmatic matter-of-factness that characterized all the wartime domestic contributions. It needed to be done. You were the one who was here to do it. You did it. The women's organizations, the Women's Auxiliary of the American Legion, the Ladies' Auxiliaries of the various churches and civic organizations, the League of Women Voters, the PTA, all became organizing infrastructure for the home front in ways that extended well beyond their pre-war functions. The PTA, for example, became a coordination point for school lunch programs, for victory garden initiatives in school grounds, and for the collection and distribution of information about rationing and nutrition. The women who led these organizations were, without any drama about it, managing significant community welfare operations, identifying which families were in crisis, organizing the response, coordinating the resources. The social history of the 1940s American home front is in many ways the history of these organizations, and of the women who ran them. But I want to step back from the organizational level and come back to the individual. The woman next door at the back door at 9:30 in the morning with the tomatoes. What she brought was not just tomatoes. She brought the news of the neighborhood. Who had received a letter? Who had not? Which family's boy had been reported missing? Which family had gotten good news that a missing one had only been captured? She brought the information that the butcher on Elm Street had received a shipment of pork shoulders that was not yet depleted. She brought the observation that the woman 2 houses down had not been out in 3 days and might need a check-in visit. She brought, in other words, the social maintenance of the street. And when she left, carrying a jar of green beans from the canning shelf in exchange for the tomatoes, the exchange had accomplished something more than the economic transaction of 2 households smoothing out their surplus and deficit across the fence. It had maintained the connection. In the years after the war, when the suburban expansion accelerated and car ownership increased and the physical density of the old neighborhood began to dissolve, when families began to live in larger houses on larger lots with less visible access to their neighbors, something was lost that was not simply privacy gained. The infrastructure of mutual aid that had made the wartime neighborhood function so effectively was not a wartime invention. It was a wartime intensification of something that had always existed in dense human communities. The daily fabric of obligation and exchange and shared knowledge that holds people together in proximity. When the war ended and the men came home and the women who had run the neighborhood stepped back from their block warden roles and their Red Cross chapters and their letter-writing circles, the institutional structures dissolved. But the knowledge of how to do it, the knowledge that it was possible, that women were capable of running these structures, that the neighborhood as a unit of social organization was a real and functional thing, that knowledge did not entirely go away. It was carried by the women who had lived it, even when the structures it had animated were no longer there to express it. That is one of the things I find most worth acknowledging about the wartime American community. It demonstrated, at scale, across 4 years and in every corner of the country, that ordinary women with ordinary resources and no particular official authority could organize and maintain the social infrastructure of their communities under conditions of considerable stress. They did not need to be appointed to do it. They did not need to be paid. They needed to see what needed to be done, and to understand that they were the ones who were there to do it. And the back door knocked, and the tomatoes changed hands, and the neighborhood held. There was a letter on the counter. It had been there since this morning. She had seen it when she came in from the garden, and she had put it on the counter next to the bread box, and she had not opened it yet. Not because she was afraid of it, though there was always the awareness of what a letter from the Pacific could contain, but because she was not ready yet. Because opening a letter from her husband was an event, not a task, and events required the right moment. The right moment was after the children were in bed. She would sit at the kitchen table then, with the kitchen light on and the rest of the house quiet, and she would open it carefully at the top with the bread knife. She had a particular way of opening his letters, slitting just the top edge, not tearing, and she would unfold the V-mail sheet and read it through once quickly, to know that he was all right, and then she would read it again slowly, taking in everything. But that was for later. Right now the letter was on the counter, and the peas needed shelling, and the afternoon was what it was. I want to talk about the letter. Not the specific letter on this specific counter, but what letters from the war meant as a category of experience. What it meant to be a woman in a wartime household waiting for a letter, receiving a letter, preparing to answer a letter, and living in the intervals between letters. The mail from overseas was the primary link between the home front and the actual war. Not the newspapers, which reported the war in the aggregate, the strategic movements, the casualty figures, the political decisions. Not the radio, which brought Edward R. Murrow's resonant voice from London or the official military communiques from the Pacific Theatre. Those things told you about the war as history, as something being recorded. The letter told you about the war as a person, as a specific man in a specific place, dealing with specific circumstances, thinking about home. The V-mail system. V-mail, short for Victory Mail, was introduced in the summer of 1942 and was one of the genuine logistical innovations of the war. The problem it solved was straightforward. Conventional letter mail from servicemen overseas was consuming enormous amounts of cargo space on the ships crossing the Pacific and the Atlantic. The ships were needed for military supplies. The letters were morale. Both were necessary. V-mail's solution was to photograph letters and reduce them. A letter written on a standard V-mail form was photographed onto microfilm, 1,600 letters fitted onto a single roll of film, and the film was flown to a processing center near its destination, where the letters were printed at reduced size on small, thin sheets of paper and delivered. A sack of microfilm that weighed just 4 to 5 pounds could carry the same correspondence that would have required 2,200 pounds of conventional mail. This was efficiency. It was also, inevitably, a slight change in the quality of the connection. The letters that arrived were smaller, postcard-sized, the handwriting reduced. Some women found they needed to hold the letters at a certain distance to read them clearly, or use a magnifying glass. The tactile quality of a letter from your husband, the paper he had touched, the weight of the envelope, was diminished in the V-mail version. You were reading a photograph of his letter, not the letter itself. Some letters were still sent conventional, when the sender had something they wanted to say that the small format could not contain. A conventional letter took longer and used more shipping space, but it arrived in his actual handwriting at the actual size he had written it, and you could feel the pen impressions on the paper and see where he had paused or crossed something out or added a thought in the margin. Women saved both. They kept boxes of letters. They reread them. The censorship. Every letter from overseas, outgoing from a serviceman and often incoming to them, was reviewed by a military censor. The censor's job was to ensure that no information about troop movements, positions, casualties, or military operations could be extracted from personal correspondence, because the letters were identified as a potential intelligence risk. The Germans and Japanese had their own intelligence services, and a letter that mentioned a specific ship or a specific atoll or a specific unit could, in theory, compromise security. In practice, this meant that letters arrived with passages blacked out or cut out, literally cut from the paper, leaving rectangular holes where words had been, and the writers of letters had internalized the censorship to the point of writing around it automatically. He did not write where he was. He wrote about the heat, which told her the tropics. He wrote about the fish, which told her the ocean. He wrote about a particular kind of sky at a particular time of evening, which told her he was watching the same sky she was watching, just from a different piece of it. These were the codes of love operating within the codes of war. And she, on her end, had her own censorship to practice. She could not tell him that she was frightened. Not directly. She could not write the full weight of what she was carrying, because his ability to do his job depended partly on believing that she was managing, that home was stable, that the children were fine, that he did not need to worry. She wrote cheerful letters about the garden and the children and the neighbor's new baby and the rationing recipes she had been trying. She wrote about the small dailiness of the life he had left, the details that, she understood, were what he most needed to hear. She was managing his morale from a distance of several thousand miles. This was its own form of labor, as real and as constant as the physical labor of the kitchen. The gold star flags. I need to speak about this carefully because it belongs to the part of the wartime domestic experience that was carried most privately and most silently. A gold star flag, a small banner with a gold star on a white background with a red border, was displayed in the window of a household that had lost a service member. The blue star flag, with a blue star, indicated a family with a member currently serving. The transition from blue star to gold star was visible to the entire neighborhood, was made by the act of replacing the flag in the window, and was one of the most public acts of private grief that the wartime home front required. The neighborhood watched for these transitions. You did not have to knock on the door to know what had happened. You saw it in the window on your way to the bus stop or the grocery store, and you adjusted everything you did in relation to that household accordingly for weeks afterward. You brought food. You managed your own expression carefully when you passed on the street. You organized, if you were the block warden, the specific support that a household in that particular grief required. The management of fear in front of the children. This is the thing that I find hardest to speak about precisely, because it was done so well that it left very few direct traces. The women who held the emotional center of a wartime household, who knew their husbands were in the Pacific or in Italy or on an Atlantic convoy, who received the same newspapers the rest of the neighborhood received, who understood perfectly well what the casualty figures meant and how to translate a military communique into an honest assessment of the likelihood that a specific man in a specific unit was still alive. Those women chose, consistently, deliberately, on a daily basis, not to give the full weight of that knowledge to their children. This was not deception. It was protection. A child who grew up in a wartime household and was later asked, as an adult, to describe what the atmosphere was like, often said something that reveals the success of this management. I knew things were serious, but I never felt afraid. Mom was always fine. Mom was not always fine. But she had decided that what her children needed was a mother who seemed fine, and she provided that, every day, in full, as a kind of gift that asked nothing in return and that the children, in many cases, only understood in retrospect. There is a letter in the collection at the Library of Congress, written by a woman in New Jersey to a friend in 1944, not to her husband, to a friend, where she did not have to maintain the performance, and in it she says something I have been sitting with since I first read it. She says that she has been so careful, for so many months, not to show the children her fear, that she has sometimes lost track of where the performed calm ends and the real one begins. She says there are nights when she goes to bed not knowing whether she is actually all right or whether she has simply gotten very good at seeming that way. There is something in that sentence that deserves more than a moment. The psychological literature on wartime civilian experience, and there is a substantial body of this literature, built from the oral histories and the diaries and the retrospective accounts gathered by historians over the decades since, consistently identifies what researchers call emotional labor as one of the most significant and least documented costs of wartime domestic life. Emotional labor in this context means the work of managing your own emotional state in service of other people's emotional needs, maintaining a presentation of calm and competence and normalcy when your private experience is something quite different. It is not dishonesty. It is a form of care. But it has a cost. And in the wartime household, with a husband overseas and children who needed a mother who seemed fine, that cost was paid continuously, for years, by women who received no credit for it and were sometimes not even fully aware of what they were paying. The radio programs were a strange comfort. Strange because the radio brought the war into the house at the same time that it served as the primary domestic entertainment. Jack Benny on Sunday evenings. The Andrews sisters, whose particular brand of bright wartime optimism was designed precisely for the emotional space these women occupied, cheerful about the prospect of reunion, steady about the fact of waiting. Glenn Miller's band, which for a generation of Americans became inseparable from the sound of the war itself, and whose disappearance in December 1944 when Miller's plane was lost over the English Channel added another specific grief to the general one that already permeated the era. And the news. The news on the radio was different from the news on the radio today, not just in its content but in its relationship to the people who listened to it. In 1943, the people listening to the news were not consuming information passively. They were receiving reports about places where people they loved were currently present. The Pacific Theater was not an abstraction. It was where Walter was. The Italian campaign was not a map segment. It was where somebody's brother was driving a supply truck up a mountain road. She learned to listen to the news with a particular kind of attention, parsing the language of military communiques for what they did not say, noting which islands or which strategic positions were being contested this week versus last week, building a mental map of the war's geography and tracking her husband's likely location within it. This was information work. Intelligence work, in the literal sense. And it happened every evening in living rooms across America, in the half hour after dinner when the children were doing homework or being gotten ready for bed, and she sat near the console radio and listened. The waiting. There is no way to describe the texture of waiting for someone to come home from a war without either understating it or overstating it, and I am going to try to simply give you a piece of it and let it stand on its own. She put a blue star in the window when he left. She had her daily routines, which were the structure that held the waiting. She had the children, who required everything she had and who made the waiting simultaneously harder and easier, harder because they needed a version of her that was not consumed by it, easier because they were the reason for continuing when continuing felt effortful. She did not count the days publicly. She noted the mail. She noted the dates on his letters and calculated how long they had taken to arrive. She noted the news. She put one foot in front of the other, which is all the management of fear ever really amounts to. And in the evenings, when the children were in bed and the letter was on the counter and the kitchen was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table and read it again, slowly, taking in everything, looking for the parts between the lines that the censor had not managed to reach. The child asked, on a Wednesday in November, whether Daddy was coming home for Thanksgiving. She had been waiting for this question. It had been building for a week, she could feel it building, the way children build toward questions they sense might have difficult answers, circling the subject from a distance before finally arriving at it directly. She had prepared her answer, or thought she had. She had the words ready and the face ready and the composure ready. And then the question came, and all of it was inadequate, and she gave the true answer, which was that she didn't know, that they would hope, and then she turned back to the pot on the stove so that her face was not visible, and she kept stirring. Parenting under wartime conditions. I want to spend this act on the children, on what it meant to raise them through the war years, on what the women who did it understood, and did not understand, and could not understand until it was over, about what they were asking of themselves and what they were giving their children. First, the simple facts. Approximately 11 million American men served in the armed forces between 1941 and 1945. The vast majority of them had families. Many had children. 4 significant periods during the war, those children were growing up in households where their fathers were absent, away in training, away overseas, away on an indefinite timeline that neither parent could predict with any confidence. The developmental psychology literature is clear on what paternal absence means for children at various ages. Infants and toddlers who grow up without a primary male caregiver show specific patterns of adjustment and readjustment when that figure returns. Older children manage the absence differently, understanding more, worrying more, developing specific behaviors and strategies for managing their own anxiety about it. But the developmental psychology literature was not available to the women of the 1940s in any practically applicable form. They were parenting by instinct, by the models their own parents had provided, and by the accumulated wisdom of the neighborhoods and communities they were embedded in. What they had, consistently, was a deep intuitive sense that children needed stability. That need for stability, for the household to feel consistent, predictable, managed, was one of the primary drivers of the wartime domestic routines that now seem, from a distance, almost excessive in their orderliness. The wartime household ran by routine not because routine was inherently virtuous but because routine communicated to children that the world was still functioning, that someone was in charge, that the structure of daily life had not been disrupted by the enormous disruption that they could sense was happening even when they were not being told about it directly. Breakfast at a consistent time. School at a consistent time. Dinner at a consistent time. Chores assigned and expected. Bedtime enforced. These were not expressions of rigidity. They were messages of reassurance. The message was, things are normal here. And as long as things are normal here, you are safe. The lie at the center of this reassurance, the fact that things were not normal, that the absence at the table was the realest thing in the room, was one that most wartime mothers maintained with enormous skill and considerable cost to themselves. The maintenance of normality for the children was the job that ran underneath every other job. The creativity required. This is the part of wartime parenting that I find most impressive in retrospect, and that I think is most worth examining carefully. A wartime mother in 1943 was attempting to provide her children with a functional childhood inside a context of genuine scarcity and genuine uncertainty. Birthday parties existed, but without the abundance of pre-war parties. Christmas happened, but the presents under the tree were fewer and more modest and sometimes made by hand rather than purchased. There were no bananas. There was limited chocolate. There was a sugar ration that covered approximately one small jar of hard candy for a child per month, and not always that. The woman who worked within these constraints to give her children something that still felt like a childhood, that still felt, from the inside, like a life worth living and worth celebrating, was doing a form of creative work that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The birthday cake. A wartime birthday cake was a document of ingenuity. The standard birthday cake of the pre-war era called for real butter, refined sugar in quantity, multiple eggs, whole milk, and real vanilla. None of these was fully available in 1943. The baker who attempted a wartime birthday cake was working with what she had, which might be a small amount of butter, the weekly sugar ration supplemented by saccharine, dried egg powder reconstituted with water, and evaporated canned milk, and what she was attempting to produce from these compromised ingredients was something that would still look like a celebration, that would still carry candles and still be brought to the table with singing and still make a child's face do what a child's face does when a cake is brought to the table. The recipes they developed were real adaptations, not simply degraded versions of the pre-war standard. A depression cake, also called wacky cake, for reasons I described in the reference script, used no eggs and no butter and produced a genuine chocolate cake. A boiled raisin cake, a recipe with antecedents going back to the First World War, used lard and no fresh eggs and kept well, which mattered in a household where you might not be able to serve an entire cake the day it was baked. Carrot cake used the natural sweetness of carrots to reduce the sugar requirement, and carrot cake, as it turned out, was actually delicious. The child at whose birthday this cake was brought to the table did not know that it was an act of creative problem-solving as well as a celebration of their existence. They knew only that there was a cake and it was for them. That is, perhaps, the most elegant outcome of the wartime kitchen's creativity. The work was invisible to its beneficiaries. The children's chores. This is a dimension of wartime childhood that tends to be underemphasized in the nostalgic version of the era, but that was genuinely significant both for the households and for the children themselves. Children in 1940s wartime households were expected to contribute, in specific and meaningful ways, to the household's operation. Not token contributions. Real ones. A child of 10 or 11 in a 1943 household might be responsible for maintaining the victory garden, for weeding specific rows, for monitoring the ripeness of specific vegetables, for bringing in the harvest when it came. A child of 12 or 13 might take over the management of the icebox or the refrigerator, keeping it organized, reporting when things were running low, learning the spatial logic of food storage. An older teenager in a household where the mother also worked in a war plant might be responsible for starting dinner, a specific dish, with a specific recipe, left out on the counter with the ingredients measured and ready. This was not exploitation. This was the integration of children into the functioning of a household that needed their contribution to function. And the children, in the accounts that survive, did not universally resent this. Many of them describe it, in retrospect, as one of the things that gave them a sense of genuine competence and importance during years when so much else was beyond their control. The child who grew the peas and helped to can them had a relationship to those peas in January that the child who only ate them did not have. They understood that they had contributed to the household's survival in a direct and traceable way. That understanding, that sense of genuine consequence, your work here matters and you can see the result of it, is something that modern childhood, for all its many advantages, often struggles to provide. The emotional conversations. How do you talk to a child about a war? Not about the strategic movements and the political decisions and the historical forces, that is a later conversation, for older children, for school. But about the immediate, personal, daily war. About why daddy is away. About what the news on the radio means. About what happens if the answer to certain kinds of questions is not a good one. The women who navigated this did so, for the most part, with a pragmatism and a warmth that the available evidence consistently reflects. They did not shield their children entirely from the reality of the war. That would have been impossible, given how pervasively the war was present in the culture. They did not explain the war to children in terms of its full horror. That would have been cruel and unnecessary. They found a middle language, a child-scale version of the truth that conveyed enough for a child to understand what was happening without carrying a weight that a child was not equipped to carry. Daddy is fighting to protect our country. The soldiers are brave. We are helping by planting the garden and saving our stamps. We are waiting for him to come home. This is not a lie. It is a redaction. A version of the truth scaled to the capacity of the listener. And in the evenings, when the children were asleep and the version could be set aside, she sat in the kitchen with the truth. And the truth was that she did not know when he was coming home. That she read the Pacific casualty figures in the newspaper with a specific personal attention that she did not discuss with anyone. That there was a letter on the counter that she had read 3 times already and would read again tomorrow. But the children knew that daddy was coming home. Because she had decided that they would know that. The managing of holidays. I want to give you Thanksgiving 1943, briefly, because I think it is a particularly revealing moment. The Thanksgiving turkey was rationed in the sense that turkey required red stamps, and the acquisition of a whole turkey for the holiday meal required a significant proportion of the monthly meat allocation. Some families chose to acquire a whole turkey and supplement the rest of the month's meat with lower point options. Others managed the compromise differently, a smaller turkey, a chicken, a turkey breast rather than the whole bird, supplemented with the unrationed foods that were available and that she had been planning toward all month. The table was set. The best tablecloth came out of the linen drawer. The children helped to set the places with the good china, the china that was used only for holidays and that they handled carefully because they understood, without being told explicitly, that it was precious. She lit candles. The meal appeared. Not the meal of a normal year, before the war. But a meal. A real one, with effort and care visible in every dish, the turkey that had required planning to afford, the vegetables that had come from her own canning shelf, the cranberry sauce that had required the allocation of blue stamps, the pies that used the week's sugar ration and her own canned fruit and the pie crust that she had made by hand. And at the table was the empty chair. Not discussed. Present. The family arranged itself around it. She said grace, and they ate, and the children talked about school and the neighborhood and the petty dramas of their daily world, and she listened and responded and passed the vegetables and poured the milk, and the meal was what a meal is supposed to be. And when it was done and the dishes were cleared and the children were in bed, she sat for a little while in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the quiet. It was something. It had been something. That is what I want to say about the wartime Thanksgiving, and about the wartime Christmas, and about every birthday and ordinary Tuesday that she managed under conditions of genuine difficulty. It was something. And she made it something. The dishes were done by 7:45. The kitchen was clean in the wartime sense of the word, which meant the surfaces were wiped, the leftovers were dealt with, the dish towel was folded over the oven handle to dry. Not spotless. Clean. There was a difference, and the distinction between the two took years to earn and the wartime years sharpened it further. Spotless was a luxury. Clean was what you maintained. The children were in bed. The bedtime routines of a 1940s wartime household were, in most of the accounts I have read, both more elaborate and more consistent than they are today. Not in terms of their content. Bedtime stories existed, prayers were said, the familiar rituals of preparation for sleep have not changed much in 80 years. But in their consistency. The routine was the structure. And the structure was the point. She tucked them in. She sat on the edge of the bed. If there was a prayer, she said it with them. The children's prayers of the era were simple and warm, small requests for protection and thanks for the day's good things. If there was a story, it was brief, because she had things to do downstairs and because children, in the experience of every mother who has ever existed, fall asleep faster when the story stops than when it continues. Then the light went off. The door was left slightly open so the ambient warmth of the house could circulate. And she came back downstairs. This moment, the return to the kitchen after the children were down, was, in the wartime household, a particular kind of threshold. On one side of it, the performance. The management of the household as it appeared to the people who needed her to be managing. On the other side, herself. Not that she collapsed, or cried, or fell apart. In most cases she did not. But she did, in those quiet evening hours, become something slightly different. Less performed. More interior. The mending basket. I want to spend a moment on the mending basket because it is one of those specific, physical artifacts of the wartime domestic world that has been almost entirely lost from modern domestic life, and that loss tells you something interesting. In the 1940s, fabric rationing meant that clothes were not replaced when they wore out. They were repaired. A sock with a hole in the heel was darned. A shirt with a fraying cuff was turned and restitched. A dress that no longer fit its owner was taken apart at the seams and remade for the child who had grown into the next size. The mending basket, a wicker basket or a fabric bag, typically kept near the chair where she sat in the evenings, was always full. It was never entirely empty. There was always something that needed attention, something that had been set aside because the morning was too busy and the afternoon was given to other things, and now it was evening and here was the basket. She sat with it in the evenings after the dishes and after the children, in the living room near the console radio, and she mended. The needle moving through the fabric. The particular light of a single lamp. Electricity was not wasted in a 1940s home. You lit the room you were in and left the others dark. The radio playing. This is the image of the wartime evening that I find most consistently beautiful, when I allow myself to find beauty in it. A woman in a chair, near a lamp, with a basket of things that need her attention, and a radio playing Glenn Miller or Jack Benny or the Andrews Sisters, and the house quiet around her. She was not wasting time. She was not doing nothing. She was maintaining the household in the only hours it could be maintained without interrupting anything else, and she was doing it in the company of the radio, which was the closest thing the 1940s offered to background entertainment while the hands worked. The radio programs in the evenings were a specific kind of comfort. Jack Benny on Sunday evenings. His show ran from 1932 to 1955, and at its wartime peak attracted over 11 million weekly listeners. His particular brand of humor, self-deprecating, warmly absurd, built on long-running character jokes that rewarded loyal listening, had the specific quality of a familiar friend. You knew what to expect from Jack Benny, and knowing what to expect from something was, in the wartime years, a form of comfort that it is hard to overstate. Fibber McGee and Molly. The Lone Ranger. Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. These were not just entertainment programs. They were social institutions, shared cultural references that the whole country held simultaneously, that gave people in a time of enormous uncertainty a stable roster of familiar things to return to each week. The news programs were different. Edward R. Murrow broadcasting from London. Gabriel Heater with his characteristic opening, "There's good news tonight" on the good nights, his voice heavy with something other than good news on the bad ones. The daily 15-minute war summary that most families organized their evenings around, gathering near the set when the time came, going quiet while the announcer spoke. She listened to the news with a particular kind of attention that was not the same as entertainment listening. She was scanning. She was listening for the specific names of the specific theaters of the war where the specific people she loved were located. The Pacific, the European theater, the Atlantic convoys. She was translating the announcer's careful military language into her own private assessment of likelihood and proximity. She was doing the math that every home front wife and mother was doing simultaneously in living rooms across the country. Not out loud. In her head, while her hands worked the mending. The ironing. Monday was washing day. Tuesday was ironing day. This was not merely custom, it was logistics. Wet laundry, hung on the Monday clothesline, was dry by Tuesday. The ironing had to happen before the clothes were needed again, which in a household with children in school and a husband in work meant completion by Wednesday morning at the absolute latest. The ironing was done with a flat iron. Not a steam iron, those were not widely available in the 1940s. A flat iron, heated on the gas range to a temperature that had to be judged by hand, held near the face, or spat on to test the sizzle, and then applied to the fabric with care, because an iron that was too hot would scorch and an iron that was too cool would not smooth. She had 2 irons. This is a small but telling detail. 2 irons, so that while one was being used, the other was reheating on the range. Because a single iron cooled before the ironing was done, and going back and forth to reheat a single iron added 20 minutes to a job that was already occupying most of a morning. 2 irons was efficient. 2 irons was the product of someone who had thought carefully about the logistics of a job she had to do regularly and had optimized it accordingly. That optimization instinct, the drive to do the necessary thing as efficiently as possible, to eliminate wasted time and wasted motion, was one of the most consistent qualities of the wartime housewife. Not because she had been trained in efficiency. Because her day had more things in it than time to do them, and optimization was the only way to make everything fit. The end of the evening came somewhere around 9 or 9:30. The radio went off, or she moved away from it, into the kitchen, for the last tasks of the day. She checked the pantry. She noted what would be needed in the morning, whether the coffee was sufficient, whether there was milk for the children's breakfast, whether the oatmeal needed to be started soaking the night before. She checked the ration book, briefly, confirming her own count of what remained. She washed her face at the kitchen sink. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs to the bedroom, and she lay down in the quiet of the house, and she listened for a moment to whatever sounds the neighborhood made, a car passing on the street, a dog somewhere, the creak of the house settling, and then she closed her eyes. Tomorrow was another full day. Tomorrow the coffee would go on before anyone else was awake, and the routine would begin again, the same sequence executed again with the same competence and the same quietness and the same absence of anyone acknowledging that it was happening. She did not need it acknowledged. She was doing what needed to be done. That is, perhaps, the truest thing I can say about the wartime evening. Not that it was peaceful, it was not always peaceful. Not that it was content, she was often worried, often tired, often running the calculations of tomorrow's meals against the shortfall of this week's stamps. But it was managed. It was held together. By the time she turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs, the household was ready for tomorrow. She had made it ready. And in the morning, when the coffee went on again and the blue ring of the gas range ignited and the first light came through the east window, the household would wake into a day that was, because of her, possible. There is a question I want to leave with this act, and I want to leave it very gently because it is not a question with an obvious answer. When was the last time you sat in a quiet room in the evening and did something with your hands? Not scrolling. Not watching. Something with your hands that produced a small, physical result, a mended thing, a baked thing, a grown thing, a made thing. I think about the women in those wartime evenings, with their mending baskets and their radio programs and their quiet management of a household that needed them. And I think about the particular quality of presence that comes from having done something physical at the end of a long day. Not the passive consumption of content. The active small achievement of something made. There is a satisfaction in it that screens do not replicate. The 1940s housewife knew that satisfaction daily. Not because she was virtuous. Because she had no alternative. And I find myself wondering, sometimes, whether the alternative we've built, the one that fills the evening hours with content rather than craft, has given us something in that exchange, and what we may have quietly set down. The war ended twice. The first ending was dramatic. V-Day, May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered and the streets of American cities filled with people and confetti and the sound of people making a noise they had been holding back for 4 years. VJ Day, August 15, 1945, when Japan announced its surrender and the war that had begun on a Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor was over at last. The second ending was quieter and took much longer and was, in some ways, harder. It was the ending in the kitchen. The ending in the ration book. The ending in the roll. Rationing in the United States did not end on VJ Day. Sugar remained rationed until June 1947. Certain other goods remained controlled for varying periods. The infrastructure of wartime consumption, the calculations, the substitutions, the management, the planning, did not dissolve the moment the headlines announced peace. It wound down slowly, over months and years, like a machine that had been running at full capacity for so long that it could not simply stop. And the women who had been running that machine, who had developed, over 4 years of wartime management, a comprehensive set of skills and habits and forms of knowledge that they had not possessed before, found themselves navigating a post-war world that sent them very mixed signals about what to do with what they had become. The pressure to step back. I want to address this part of the story directly, because it is one of the most significant and most under-examined aspects of the post-war period, and because understanding it is essential to understanding what happened to the skills and knowledge the wartime housewife had developed. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 6 million American women entered the paid workforce for the first time, filling jobs in defense plants, shipyards, government offices, and service industries vacated by the men who had gone to war. Women operated lathes, welded hulls, assembled aircraft, drove trucks. Women who had previously never left the domestic sphere discovered, under wartime necessity, that they were capable of a range of physical and technical tasks that the pre-war culture had told them were beyond them. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster. She was a documentary fact, multiplied 6 million times. And in the spring and summer of 1945, when the men began coming home, the cultural machinery that had encouraged women into the workforce began encouraging them out of it. With considerable force. Magazines that had spent the war years running stories about the capable working woman pivoted, almost overnight, to running stories about the fulfillment available in the domestic sphere. The popular press, the advertising industry, and the government itself all began constructing and promoting what historians have called the post-war feminine ideal: the happy housewife, homemaker, suburban mother, content in her kitchen, focused on her family. The timing was not coincidental. The men who came home needed the jobs. The economy needed the men to have the jobs. The social narrative that accomplished this transition fastest was the narrative that told women their fulfillment lay at home, that their wartime work had been a temporary patriotic contribution gladly rendered, and that the natural and desirable place for a woman was the domestic sphere. Many women absorbed this message. Some had always wanted to return to full-time domestic life and were genuinely glad to do so. Some accepted it with varying degrees of private conflict that the available evidence suggests was often suppressed rather than expressed. And some did not accept it at all. The women who had managed defense plant workforces and driven trucks and welded aircraft components did not all quietly return to the kitchen and forget what they had been capable of. Some of them pushed back. Some of them found ways to maintain their position in the workforce. Some of them carried forward the independence they had discovered under wartime necessity into a post-war life that looked different from what the magazines were recommending. The feminist historians who documented this transition in the decades after the war have described it as one of the most significant unresolved tensions of the post-war American social history: the gap between what women had demonstrated they could do and what the post-war social narrative said they should want to do. That tension did not resolve itself quickly. It simmered through the 1950s and erupted in the early 1960s, when Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave it a name and a public framework. But I want to make a slightly different point about this transition. Even the women who returned to full-time domestic life after the war, the women who did not, or could not, push back against the pressure, who returned to the kitchen without significant external protest, those women were not simply returning to what they had been before. They had learned things that did not teach themselves. The wartime housewife of 1943 knew how to manage a household under conditions of genuine scarcity. She knew how to read a ration book and plan a week's nutrition within a constrained budget of points. She knew how to grow food in a small space, preserve it in jars, and use it strategically across the winter months. She knew how to repair and mend and maintain rather than replace and discard. She knew how to organize her neighbors, manage community information, and function as an institution in the absence of any formal authority telling her to do so. She also knew that she could do these things. That knowledge, the knowledge of her own competence, demonstrated repeatedly over 4 years of genuine necessity, was not something a magazine article could confiscate. The post-war transition was complicated by the return of the men themselves. The men who came home from the Pacific and from Europe had been changed by what they had experienced in ways that both they and their families were unprepared for. The psychological literature on combat trauma was, in 1945, almost non-existent in practical terms. There was no organized support structure for the adjustment difficulties that men and families experienced when the servicemen came home. There was only the expectation, powerful, culturally enforced, that things would return to normal. Normal, for the family that had spent 3 years without its father, was a complicated concept. Children who had grown up during the years of absence had developed relationships with their mothers as the central and sole domestic authority. The arrival of a father who was unfamiliar, who had been abstracted for years into the category of daddy who is coming home, and who now had physical presence and authority and often significant adjustment difficulties, this was not a simple addition to the household. It was a renegotiation. The women who managed this transition did so with, in many cases, the same skill and the same quiet competence with which they had managed everything else. They held the household center while it recalibrated itself around the returned man. They managed the emotional adjustment of the children. They managed their own adjustment, which included, in many households, a renegotiation of the authority and independence they had exercised in the absence. She was asked to step back from a role she had filled entirely alone for years. Many did. And many did it gracefully, or as gracefully as it could be done, because the man they were stepping back for was often wounded in ways they could see and in ways they could not, and he needed something from the household that the household could only give if she made it possible. This is not a simple story. It is a story about two people, changed by different versions of the same war, trying to reconstruct a life together in a world that was different from the one they had left and that kept telling them it was the same. Now I want to talk about what endured. Because the skills and habits of the wartime housewife did not disappear entirely, even as the culture worked to contain and redirect them. They were transmitted, in the specific, practical way that knowledge is transmitted when it exists in the hands and the habits rather than in the books, from the women who had developed them to the women who came after. The daughter who had grown up in the wartime household, who had seen her mother manage the ration book and tend the victory garden and put up the canning and keep the household running under conditions of genuine difficulty, had absorbed something that she did not need to articulate in order to carry. She knew that it was possible to manage on less. She had seen it managed. She knew that food could be grown in a small space, that a garden was not an amenity but a resource, that a jar of home-canned tomatoes in January was a form of wealth. She knew that clothes could be mended and meals could be stretched and a household could be kept together by a woman who was competent and determined and doing what needed to be done. This is knowledge that does not announce itself. It exists quietly, in the background of a life, available when it is needed. There is a phrase that historians of the home front use, the culture of sufficiency, and I think it is one of the most useful concepts to emerge from the study of this period. It describes a relationship to resources that is characterized not by abundance or by deprivation, but by the careful and competent management of enough. The wartime housewife operated within a culture of sufficiency not because it was her ideology but because it was her daily practice. And that practice, over 4 years, became her character. The women who lived through the wartime years and managed their households as well as they did were not operating on courage alone, though courage was certainly part of it. They were operating on the accumulated competence of everything they had learned to do under constraint. They could be proud of that. They were proud of that, in the quiet way that is indistinguishable from simply getting on with things. I keep returning to the question of what we have half forgotten from these women. Not the obvious things. Not the recipes, though the recipes matter. Not the ration book management, which belongs to a specific historical context that has not recurred. But the habits of mind that underlay all of it. The habit of planning forward, thinking not just about today's dinner but about the week's nutrition, the month's allocation, the winter's stores. The habit of using everything, not as an ideology of thrift but as a practice that was embedded deeply enough to be automatic. The habit of repair, maintaining what you have rather than replacing it, both because replacement was expensive and unavailable and because maintenance was a form of respect for the thing maintained. The habit, perhaps most importantly, of competence. The 1940s housewife did not expect someone else to solve the problems of her household. She solved them herself, because there was no one else. The infrastructure of support that modern domestic life increasingly relies on, delivery services, meal kits, professional cleaners, childcare services, therapists, the whole apparatus of outsourced domestic function, did not exist for her. She was the infrastructure. And she was sufficient to the task. I am not suggesting we should replicate the constraints of the wartime household. The constraint was real and genuinely hard and the women who lived it did not romanticize it even when they looked back on it with something recognizable as pride. I am suggesting that the relationship to domestic competence that those constraints produced, the confidence that you could handle what your household required, that the skills were yours and the knowledge was yours and the capacity was yours, is something worth considering in an era when so much of what we need has been outsourced so thoroughly that we have collectively lost the knowledge of how to provide it ourselves. There is a sentence from an oral history I want to share with you. It was spoken by a woman in her 80s, interviewed in the 1990s by a historian researching the home front. The historian asked her what she thought was the most important thing the wartime years had taught her. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I found out I was more capable than anyone had told me I was." That sentence. More capable than anyone had told her she was. Not more capable than she had believed, more capable than anyone had told her she was. The gap between those two phrasings matters. She had not expected competence from herself. The world she had grown up in had not provided her with that expectation. The war had given her the conditions in which competence was required, and she had risen to meet those conditions, and in doing so she had discovered something about herself that the pre-war world had not thought to show her. I find that sentence one of the most quietly powerful things in the entire oral history of the home front. Because it suggests that what the war gave these women, beyond the skills, beyond the knowledge, beyond the habits of mind, was an honest account of their own capacity. That account was not always accepted afterward. The post-war culture worked hard to contain it, to redirect it, to tell women that their competence was admirable but not the point, that the point was something smaller and more domestic and less public. Many women accepted this. The circumstances of their lives and the expectations of the people they loved often did not leave much room for anything else. But the knowledge did not go away. It was there. Carried quietly. Available when needed. And it passed, in the specific and unannounced way that knowledge passes between people who live together, from the women who had learned it to the daughters and granddaughters who came after. You are, if you are the grandchild or great-grandchild of a woman who managed a wartime American household, the downstream beneficiary of something that was developed under conditions of genuine necessity, over 4 years, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and ivory soap and bacon grease and, in August, the particular steam of a pressure canner running at 10 pounds. You may carry traces of it without knowing exactly where they came from. The instinct that prompts you to check what's in the refrigerator before you plan dinner rather than planning dinner first and then shopping. The slight discomfort you feel, maybe, when food is wasted without being considered. The pleasure you take in making something from scratch, a cake, a soup, a garden, a repair, that you could have purchased or hired or ordered instead. These are not memories of the wartime kitchen. They are echoes of it. Small behavioral inheritances passed down through the hands of women who learned them when they had no choice. I think that is worth knowing about. I think they are worth honoring, those women, not in the performative way of nostalgia, not in the romanticizing way that turns genuine difficulty into picturesque simplicity, but in the honest way of acknowledging that they were genuinely capable, that what they did genuinely mattered, and that some of what they knew has quietly persisted in us, whether we knew it was there or not. She was awake at 5. Not because the alarm said 5. Because she had learned, over the months since she took the job at the plant, that 5 was when the day had to begin if everything was going to get done. The factory shift started at 7. The bus came at 6:20. Before the bus, the children needed to be ready for school, fed, dressed, with their lunches packed, and before that she needed to be washed and dressed and functional herself, and before that the coffee had to go on and the oatmeal had to start and whatever she could prepare in advance for dinner had to be prepared now, at 5 in the morning, because there would be no time in the evening between the shift ending and the dinner needing to be ready. This was her day. Every day. We have spent most of this story with the women who stayed home, the housewives in the full sense of that word, the women whose primary operational theater was the domestic sphere. And that story is the story most often told when the wartime home front is discussed. But there is another story, running alongside it, that deserves its own attention. By 1944, approximately 19 million American women were employed in the paid workforce, a figure that represented a 37% increase from 1940. Many of these women were working full-time, in jobs that were often physically demanding and that operated on industrial schedules that gave no particular accommodation to the fact that their employees also had households to manage and children to care for. These women were doing 2 full-time jobs simultaneously. The domestic labor did not stop when the factory started. The children still needed to be fed and dressed and seen to school. The house still needed to be cleaned and the laundry done and the meals planned and the ration books managed. The Victory Garden still needed tending. The canning still had to happen in August whether or not the defense plant had changed the shift schedule. The women who carried both lives, the work life and the home life, the factory floor and the kitchen floor, were doing something that has been documented in the sociological literature under the name the double burden, though the name was not coined until decades after the women who first carried it were already carrying it without a name. The double burden was real. It was physically exhausting. The oral histories and letters from this period are full of the specific, practical exhaustion of women who were working 8-hour shifts in noisy, physically demanding environments and then coming home to a household that required another 4 or 5 hours of work before it was running again. But there was something else in those accounts that interests me. Pride. Not the uncomplicated pride of the government poster, the capable woman in the factory with her sleeves rolled up and her expression resolute. Something more complicated than that. The pride of someone who has discovered, under the pressure of necessity, that they can do more than they previously understood was possible. The pride of the woman who has made the bus at 6:20 every morning for 8 months without missing a shift and without her household falling apart, who has done this on her own because there was no one else to help her do it, and who knows, in the private accounting that every person makes of their own life, that she has accomplished something genuinely difficult. The childcare problem. This is the dimension of the wartime working mother's life that the historical record captures most incompletely, partly because it was mostly solved, if that is the right word, through informal networks rather than institutional ones. When a woman with children took a job at the defense plant, the question of who would be with the children while she was at work had to be answered, and it was answered differently in different households. In some families, an older child took on supervisory responsibility for younger ones, creating the 10-year-old who was functionally in charge of 6 and 7-year-olds from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. In others, a neighbor or a relative, a grandmother, an aunt, a woman next door who was not herself in the workforce, was recruited to help. In still others, the arrangements were precarious enough that they required daily renegotiation. The Lanham Act of 1940, and its wartime extension funding, provided federal support for childcare centers in communities with significant defense industry populations. By 1943, the federal government was funding approximately 3,000 childcare centers serving approximately 130,000 children. This sounds significant until you compare it to the number of children who needed care, a figure that was in the millions, not the hundreds of thousands. The federal childcare program served, at best, a small fraction of the families that needed it. The rest relied on the informal infrastructure of the neighborhood, which was real, which functioned, which was made possible by the density of community relationships that we discussed in an earlier act, the back door and the neighbor with a key and the woman 2 houses down who you had been helping and who was now helping you. The wartime neighborhood functioned as a childcare network among its other functions, and the women who relied on it were simultaneously contributing to it. The shift work created particular rhythms. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, one of the largest defense production facilities in the country, women made up a significant portion of the workforce by 1943. The shipyard operated 3 shifts, and women workers filled positions in all of them. The night shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, was particularly challenging for women with children, because it required the household to function without its primary manager overnight, while still requiring that manager to be present and functional for the children's morning routine and much of the day. The women who worked the night shift slept in the afternoon while the children were at school. This required arrangements for the hours before and after school, who was with the children in the morning gap between when school started and when she woke, who was with them in the afternoon gap between school ending and her waking for the shift. These arrangements were made. They were imperfect. They were also, in most cases, the only arrangements available. Margaret Crockett, who worked at a defense plant in Detroit during the war and whose letters to her sister in Ohio were preserved by a local historical society, wrote about her daily schedule with a precision that suggests she had calculated it many times. She described waking at 4:45 for the early shift, getting her 2 children ready for school, walking them to the corner where her neighbor watched them until the school doors opened, catching the bus, working until 3:30, stopping at the grocery store on the way home for whatever was available and affordable within the week's ration allocation, arriving home by 4:15 to start dinner, feeding the children by 5:30, bathing them by 7, getting them to bed by 7:30, doing the dishes and the morning's prep and the mending until 9, then sleeping. Total hours available for sleep, given a 4:45 wake time and a 9 o'clock bedtime, 7 hours and 45 minutes, on a good night. She wrote this schedule out not as a complaint, as an accounting. The letter from which it comes was a response to her sister's question about how she managed. This is how she managed. She counted it up and she showed her sister the arithmetic. There is something in that accounting, its precision, its lack of editorial comment, its simply here is how the day works, that I find more moving than any explicitly emotional account could be. Because the precision is the emotion. The counting is the testament. She had a schedule that held everything together by the thinnest margin of hours, and she held it by knowing it exactly. The factory itself. The work in the defense plants was often physically demanding in ways that were genuinely new to women who came from domestic backgrounds. The machines were large and loud. The hours were long. The physical requirements, standing for 8 hours, lifting, operating heavy equipment, were not trivial. Women who had spent their working lives in domestic environments had to develop new physical capacities and new technical knowledge. Many of them did. And many found the work, for all its difficulty, something more than difficult. There are oral histories from women who worked in defense plants that describe an experience that is genuinely complex, exhausting, physically difficult, dislocating, and also, this is the part that the post-war narrative suppressed, genuinely satisfying. The satisfaction of technical competence. The satisfaction of contributing to something visibly large and important. The satisfaction of being paid for your work, of having your own money in your pocket, of the particular independence that a paycheck produces. The $12 a week. The $15 a week. The first time you cashed a check with your name on it. These satisfactions were real, and the women who experienced them were changed by them, even when they could not publicly say so. Even when the same newspapers that had praised their wartime work began, in 1945, to praise their graceful return to the home. Even when they went back to the kitchen. They went back with something new. The knowledge that they could do it. That the skills required for the factory floor were learnable, that physical and technical work was within their capacity, that the world outside the domestic sphere would accept their participation when it needed it. That the paycheck was possible. This knowledge was not revocable. And in the decades after the war, in the slow and contested expansion of women's economic participation that culminated in the transformations of the 1970s and 1980s, The wartime generation's experience was one of the foundational demonstrations that made the argument for that expansion possible. Not because they made the argument publicly. Most of them did not. But because they had lived the proof. I want to come back to the woman at 5 in the morning. The one who was awake before the alarm, putting the coffee on, starting the oatmeal, preparing the lunch boxes, running the morning before the household knew it needed to be run. She was doing something that the culture of her time had no adequate category for. She was not simply a housewife, because she also held a factory job. She was not simply a worker, because the household was also entirely her responsibility and no one else was going to manage it if she didn't. She was not being acknowledged as both things simultaneously by any institution or language or social framework available to her. She was just doing what needed to be done. The double burden was real. It was heavy. It was carried in those 5 o'clock mornings and those 9 o'clock nights, in the careful calculation of lunch boxes and ration stamps and the bus schedule and the shift start time. But she carried it. And what I find, when I stay with this part of the story long enough to let its full weight be felt, is that the women who carried it were not broken by it. Not most of them. They were worn by it, sometimes deeply worn, in the way that Nella last described in her diary, the low, steady ache of having been very careful about something that should never require quite so much care. That ache was real. But they were also, in the specific and unremarkable way of people who discover their own capacity under necessity, more than they had previously understood themselves to be. More capable than anyone had told them they were. And that discovery, however partial, however complicated by the pressures and expectations that surrounded it, was real too. Both things were true at once. This is how the wartime story was lived. Not in the clean narrative of sacrifice or triumph or suffering or resilience, but in the messy, exhausted, competent, worried, quietly proud reality of actual human beings doing what needed to be done, day after day, in a specific moment of history that asked more of them than any ordinary moment could have revealed they had. They had it. They gave it. And the world they gave it to, the world we live in, shaped by decisions and discoveries and demonstrations made in those years, carries something of them in it. In the 5 o'clock mornings. In the oatmeal on the stove. In the carefully packed lunch and the managed ration book and the neighbor who watched the children at the corner until the school doors opened. In the quiet competence that was handed down, hand to hand, from the kitchen of 1943 to wherever you are right now, in the still of whatever evening has found you here. The kitchen is quiet now. The coffee has long since gone cold in the percolator. The gas range is off, the blue ring of flame that was the center of the morning has been extinguished for hours. The light coming through the east window is different now than it was at 5 o'clock. Softer. Later. The quality of light that belongs to a day that has already done its work. She has already done her work. On the counter, a dish towel, folded over the oven handle, the way she always folds it, the way her mother folded it, the specific small habit that passes from hand to hand without anyone deciding to pass it. On the shelf, a row of canning jars catching what light there is, their contents visible through the glass, the deep red of the summer's tomatoes, preserved and waiting. On the table near the bread box, a letter. Not yet opened. Or perhaps already read 3 times, and set down, and left there to be returned to later in the quiet. The world she managed from this kitchen was harder than she let on. She let you think it was simple. It was not simple. But the dish towel is folded, and the jars are full, and the household is ready for tomorrow. She made it ready. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Did your grandmother or great-grandmother live through the 1940s home front? Is there something she made, or something she said, or a habit she carried quietly for the rest of her life, the way she folded a dish towel, or kept a jar of something on a shelf, or woke before anyone else and put the coffee on first, that you still carry with you now? I would genuinely love to hear it in the comments.